Welcome to Sniper's Rest. Sniper's Rest is the last best rest stop in the here and there, the place between where you're coming from and where you're going. I am Sniper Shadow, and I reside here in Sniper's Rest as a guide and custodian to those who pass through here. I visit the worlds within the multiverse often, but I am always here to guide and care for travelers such as yourself that pass through the here and there. Today, we continue reading the series of short stories by H.P. Lovecraft. The Dreams in the Witch House continues this week, and Gilman is continuing to fall deeper and deeper into his odd visions and dreams. Let's see what happens next. He was good for nothing that morning, and stayed away from all his classes. Some unknown attraction was pulling his eyes in a seemingly irrelevant direction, for he could not help staring at a certain vacant spot on the floor. As the day advanced, the focus of his unseeing eyes changed position, and by noon he had conquered the impulse to stare at the vacancy. About 2 o'clock he went out for lunch, and as he threaded the narrow lanes of the city, he found himself turning always to the southeast. Only an effort halted him at a cafeteria in Church Street, and after the meal he felt the unknown pull still more strongly. He would have to consult a nerve specialist after all. Perhaps there was a connection with his symbolism. Meanwhile, he might at least try to break the morbid spell himself. Undoubtedly, he could still manage to walk away from the pull, so great was the resolution that he headed against it and dragged himself deliberately north along Garrison Street. By the time he had reached the bridge over the Miskatonic, he was in a cold perspiration, and he clutched at the iron railings as he gazed upstream at an ill-regarded island whose regular lines of ancient standing stones brooded suddenly in the afternoon light. Then he gave a start, for there was a clearly visible living figure on that desolate island, and a second glance told him it was certainly the strange old woman whose sinister aspect had worked itself disastrously into his dreams. The tall grass near her was moving, too, as if some other living thing were crawling close to the ground. When the old woman began to turn towards him, he fled precipitately off the bridge and into the shelter of the town's labyrinth waterfront alleys. Distant though the island was, he felt that a monstrous and invincible evil could flow from the sardonic stare of that bent, ancient figure in brown. The southeastward pull held still, and only with tremendous resolution could Gilman drag himself into the old house and up the rickety stairs. For hours he sat in silence and aimless, with his eyes shifting gradually westward. About 6 o'clock, his sharpened ears caught the whining prayers of Joe Malkowitz 2 floors below, and in a desperation he seized his hat and walked out into the sunset golden streets, letting the now directly southward pull carry him where it might. An hour later, darkness found him in open fields beyond Hangman's Brook, and the glimmering spring stars shining ahead. The urge to walk was gradually changed to an urge to leap mystically into space, and he suddenly realized just where the source of the pull lay. It was in the sky. A definite point among the stars that had a claim on him and was calling him. Apparently it was a point somewhere between Hydra and Argo Navis, and he knew that he had been urged towards it ever since he had awakened soon after dawn. In the morning it had been underfoot. Afternoon found it rising in the southeast, and now it was roughly south, but wheeling towards the west. What was the meaning of this new thing? Was he going mad? How long would it last? Again, mustering his resolution, Gilman turned and dragged himself back to the sinister old house. Mastowitz was waiting for him at the door, and seemed both anxious and reluctant to whisper some fresh bit of superstition. It was about the witchlight. Joe had been out celebrating the night before. It was Patriots' Day in Massachusetts, and had come home after midnight. Looking up at the house from the outside, he thought at first that Gilman's window was dark, but then he had seen the faint violet glow within. He wanted to warn the gentleman about that glow, for everybody in Arkham knew it was Keziah's witchlight, which played near Brown Jenkin, and the ghost of the old crone herself. He had not mentioned this before, but now he must tell about it, because it meant that Keziah and her long-toothed familiar were haunting the young gentleman. Sometimes he and Paul Kronowski, the landlord Dombrowski, thought they saw that light seeping out of the cracks in the now sealed loft above the young gentleman's room, but they had all agreed not to talk about that. However, it would be better for the gentleman to take another room and get a crucifix for some good priest like Father Imlanki. The man rambled on. Gilman felt a nameless panic clutch at his throat. He knew that Joe must have been half drunk when he came home the night before, yet this mention of a violet light in the garret window was a frightful import. It was a lambent glow of this sort which always played about the old woman and the small fairy thing in those lighter, sharper dreams which prefaced his plunge into unknown abysses, and the thought that a wakeful second person could see the dream luminescence was utterly beyond sane harbourage. Yet, where had the fellow got such an odd notion? Had he himself talked as well as walked around the house in his sleep? No, Joe said he had not, but he must check up on this. Perhaps Frank Elwood could tell him something, though he hated to ask. Fever, wild dreams, symbolism, illusions of sound and pulled towards a point in the sky, and now a suspicion of sane sleep-talking. He must stop studying, see a nerve specialist, and take himself in hand. When he climbed to a second story, he paused at Elwood's door, but saw that the youth was out. Reluctantly, he continued up the garret room, and sat down in the dark. His gaze was still pulled to the southwest, but he also found himself listening intently for some sound in the loft above, and half imagining that evil violet light seeped down through the infinitesimal crack in the low, slanted ceiling. That night, as Gilman slept, the violet light broke upon him with a heightened intensity, and the old witch and the small furry thing, getting closer than ever before, mocked him with inhuman squeals and devilish gestures. He was glad to sink into the vainly roaring twilight abyss, though the pursuit of that iridescent bubble congress and that kaleidoscopic little polyhedron was menacing and irritating. Then came the shift, as vast converging planes of slippery-looking substance loomed above and below him. A shift which ended in a flash of delirium and a blaze of unknown, alien light in which yellow, carmine, and indigo were all madly and intrinsically blended. He was half lying on a high, fantastically boulder-strated terrace above a boundless jungle of outlandish, incredible peaks, balanced plains, domes, minarets, horizontal discs poised on pinnacles, and numberless forms of greater wildness, some of stone, some of metal, which glittered gorgeously in the mixed, almost blistering glare from the polychromatic sky. Looking upwards, he saw 3 stupendous discs of flame, each of a different hue and at a different height above the infinitely distant curving horizon of low mountains. Behind him, tiers of higher terraces towered, aloft as far as he could see. The city below stretched away to the limits of vision, and he hoped that no sound would well up from it. The pavement from which he easily raised himself was a veined, polished stone beyond his power to identify, and the tiles were cut in bizarre angled shapes which struck him as less asymmetrical than based on some unearthly symmetry whose law he could not comprehend. The balustrade was high-chested, delicate, and fantastically wrought, while along the rail were ranged at short intervals little figures of grotesque design and exquisite workmanship. They, like the whole balustrade, seemed to be made of some sort of shining metal whose color could not be guessed in this chaos of mixed effulgences, and their nature utterly defied conjecture. They represented some rigid barrel-shaped object with thin horizontal arms radiating spoke-like from a central ring, and with vertical knobs or bulbs projecting from the head and the base of the barrel. Each of these knobs was a hub of system 5 long, flat, triangularly tapering arms, arranged around it like the arms of a starfish, nearly horizontal, but curving slightly away from the central barrel. The base of the bottom knob was fused with the long railing with so delicate a point of contact that several figures had been broken off and were missing. The figures were about 4.5 inches in height, while the spiky arms gave them a maximum diameter about 2.5 inches. When Gilman stood up, the tiles felt hot to his bare feet. He was wholly alone, and his first act was to walk to the balustrade and look dizzily down at the endless cyclopean city almost 2,000 feet below. As he listened, he thought he heard a rhythmic confusion of faint musical pipings, covering a wide tonal range welling up from the narrow streets beneath, and he wished he might discern the denizens of this place. The sight turned him giddy after a while, so that he would have fallen to the pavement had he not clutched instinctively at the lustrous balustrade. His hand fell on one of the projecting figures. The touch seemed to steady him slightly. It was too much, however, for the exotic delicacy of the metalwork, and the spiky figure snapped off under his grasp. Still half-dazed, he continued to clutch it, as his other hand seized the vacant space on the smooth railing. But now his oversensitive ears caught something behind him, and he looked back across the level terrace. Approaching him softly, though without any apparent furtiveness, were 5 figures, 2 which were the sinister old woman and the fanged, furry little animal. The other 3 were what sent him unconscious, for they were living entities about 8 feet high, shaped precisely like the spiky images on the balustrade, and propelling themselves by like spider wriggling of their lower set of starfish arms. Gilman awakened in his bed, drenched by a cold perspiration, and with a smarting sensation in his face and hands and feet. Springing to the floor, he washed and dressed in frantic haste, as if it were necessary for him to get out of the house as quickly as possible. He did not know where he wished to go, but he felt, once more, he would have to sacrifice his classes. The odd pull towards that spot in the sky between Hydra and Argo had abated, but another, even greater strength had taken its place. Now he felt he must go north, infinitely north. He dreaded to cross the bridge that gave a view of the desolate island in the Miskatonic, so went over the Peabody Avenue Bridge. Very often he stumbled, for his eyes and ears were chained to an extremely lofty point in the blank blue sky. After about an hour he got himself under better control, and saw that he was far from the city. All around him stretched the bleak emptiness of salt marshes, while the narrow road ahead led to Innsmouth, the ancient half-deserted town which Arkham people were so curiously unwilling to visit. Though northward pull had not diminished, he resisted it as he had resisted the other pull, and finally found that he could almost balance the one against the other. Plodding back to town, and getting some coffee at a soda fountain, he dragged himself to the public library and browsed aimlessly among the lighter magazines. Once he met some friends who remarked how oddly sunburned he looked, but he did not tell them of his walk. At 3 o'clock, he took some lunch at a restaurant, noting meanwhile that the pull had either lessened or divided itself. After that, he killed the time at a cheap cinema show, seeing the inane performance over and over again without paying any attention to it. About 9 at night, he drifted homewards and stumbled into the ancient house. Joe Mousewitch was whining unintelligible prayers, and Gilman hastened up to his own garret chamber without pausing to see if Elwood was in. It was when he turned on the feeble electric light that the shock came. At once he saw that there was something on the table which did not belong there, and a second look left no room for doubt. Lying on its side, for it could not be standing up alone, was the exotic, spiky figure in which his monstrous dream he had broken off the fantastic balustrade. No detail was missing. The rigid, barrel-shaped center, the thin, radiating arms, the knobs at each end, the flat, slightly outward-curving starfish arms spreading from those knobs. They were all there. In the electric light, the color seemed to be a kind of iridescent gray veined with green, and Gilman could see amidst his horror and bewilderment that one of the knobs ended in a jagged break corresponding to its former point of attachment to the dream railing. Only his tendency towards a dazed stupor prevented him from screaming aloud. This fusion of dream and reality was too much to bear. Still dazed, he clutched at the spiky thing and staggered downwards to his landlord Dombrowski's quarters. The whining prayers of the superstitious loom-fixer were still sounding through the mouldy halls, but Gilman did not mind them now. The landlord was in and greeted him pleasantly. No, he had not seen that thing before, and did not know anything about it, but his wife had said she found a funny tin thing in one of the beds when she fixed the rooms, at noon. Maybe that was it. Dombrowski called her, and she waddled in. Yes, that was the thing. She had found it in the young gentleman's bed, next to the wall. It had looked very queer to her, but of course the young gentleman had lots of queer things in his room. Books and curios and pictures and markings on paper. She certainly knew nothing about it. So Gilman climbed upstairs, again in a mental turmoil, convinced that he was either still dreaming, or that his somnambulism had run into incredible extremes and led him to depredations into an unknown place. Where had he got this outer thing? He did not recall seeing it at any museum in Arkham. It must have been somewhere, though, and the sight of it as he snatched it in his sleep must have caused the odd dream picture of the balustrade terrace. Next day he would make some very guarded inquiries, perhaps see a nerve specialist. Meanwhile, he would try to keep track of his somnambulism. As he went upstairs and across the garret hall, he sprinkled about some flour which he had borrowed, with frank admission to its purpose from the landlord. He had stopped at Elwood's door on the way, and had found all dark within. Entering his room, he placed a spiky thing on the table, and lay down in complete mental and physical exhaustion without pausing to undress. From the closed loft above the slanting ceiling, he thought he heard a strange scratching and padding, but he was too disorganized to even mind it. That cryptical pull from the north was getting very strong again, though it seemed now to come from a lower place in the sky. In the dazzling violet light of dream, the old woman and the fanged furry thing came again, and with greater distinctness than any other former occasion. This time they actually reached him, and he felt the crone's withered claw clutching at him. He was pulled out of bed and into an empty space, and for a moment he heard a rhythmic roaring and saw the twilight amphimorphisms and the vague abysses seething around him. But that moment was very brief, for presently he was in a crude, windowless little space, with rough beams and planks rising to a peak just above his head, and with a curious slanting floor underfoot. Propped level on that floor were low cases full of books, of every degree of antiquity and disintegration, and in the center were a table and bench, apparently fastened in place. Small objects of unknown shape and nature were ranged on top of the cases, and in the flaming violet light Gilman thought he saw a counterpart of the spiky image which had puzzled him so horribly. on the left of the floor fell abruptly away, leaving a triangular gulf out of which a second dry rattling there presently climbed the hateful furry thing with its yellow fangs and bearded human face. The evilly grinning Beldman clutched at him, and beyond the table stood a figure he had never seen before. A tall, lean man, wholly devoid of either hair or beard, and wearing, as his only garments, a shapeless robe of some heavy black fabric. His feet were indistinguishable because of the table and the bench, but must have been shod, as there was a clicking whenever he changed position. The man did not speak, and bore no trace of expression on his small, regular features. He merely pointed to a book of prodigious size which lay open on the table, while the Beldman thrust a huge grey quill into Gilman's right hand. Over everything was a pall of intensely maddening fear, and the climax was reached when the furry thing ran up the dreamer's clothing to his shoulders, then down his left arm, finally biting him sharply on the wrist just below the cuff. As the blood spurted from his wound, Gilman lapsed into a faint. He awakened on the morning of the 22nd with a pain in his left wrist, and saw that his cuff was brown with dried blood. His recollections were very confused, but the scene with the man and the unknown space stood out vividly. The rats must have bitten him as he slept, giving rise to the climax of that frightful dream. Opening the door, he saw that the flower in the corridor was undisturbed except for the huge prints of the loutish fellow who roomed at the other side of the garret. So he had not been sleepwalking this time. But something would have been done about those rats. He would speak to the landlord about them. Again he tried to stop up the hole at the base of the slanting wall, wedging in a candlestick, which seemed about the right size. His ears were ringing horribly, as if with the residual echoes of some horrible noise heard in dreams. As he bathed and changed his clothes, he tried to recall what he had dreamed after the scene in the violent litten space, but nothing definite would crystallize in his mind. That scene itself must have corresponded to the sealed loft overhead, which had begun to attack his imagination so violently. But later impressions were faint and hazy. There were suggestions of the vague twilight abysses, and of the still vaster, blacker abysses beyond them. The abysses in which all fixed suggestion of form were absent. He had been taken there by the bubble congresses and the little polyhedron which always dogged him. But they themselves, like himself, had changed to wisps of milky, barely luminous mist in this farther void of ultimate blackness. Something else had gone on ahead, a larger wisp, which was now and then condensed into nameless approximations of form. And he thought that their progress had not been in a straight line, but rather in long alien curves and spirals of some ethereal vortex which obeyed laws unknown to the physics and mathematics of any conceivable cosmos. Eventually there had been a hint of vast leaping shadows, of a monstrous half-acoustic pulsing, and of the thin, monotonous piping of an unseen flute. But that was all. Gilman decided he had picked up the last conception from what he had read in the Necronomicon about the mindless entity Arazoth, which rules all time and space from a curiously ironed black throne in the center of chaos. When the blood was washed away, the wrist was proved very slight, and Gilman puzzled over the location of the 2 tiny punctures. It occurred to him that there was no blood on the bedspread where he had lain, which was very curious in the view of the amount on his skin and cuff. He had been sleepwalking within his room, and the rat had bitten him as he sat in some chair or paused in some less rational position. He looked in every corner for brownish drops or stains, but did not find any. He had better, he thought, sprinkle flour within the room as well, and outside the door, though, after all, no further proof of his sleepwalking was needed. He knew he did walk, and the thing to do now was to stop it. He must ask Frank Elwood for help. This morning the strange pulls from space seemed lessened, though they were replaced by another sensation even more explicable. It was a vague, insistent pulse to fly away from his present situation, but held not a hint of specific direction in which he wished to fly. As he picked up the strange, spiky image on the table, he thought the older northward pull grew a trifle stronger, but even so, it was wholly overruled by the newer and more bewildering urge. He took the spiky image down to Elwood's room, sealing himself against the whines of the loom fixer which welled up from the ground floor. Elwood was in, thank heaven, and appeared to be stirring about. There was time for a little conversation before leaving for breakfast, and his colleague, so Gilman hurried, poured a forth account of his recent dreams and fears. His host was very sympathetic and agreed that something ought to be done. He was shocked by his guest's drawn, haggard aspect, and noticed the queer, abnormal-looking sunburn which others had remarked during the past week. There was not much, though, he could say. He had not seen Gilman on any sleepwalking expedition, and had no idea what the curious image could be. He had, though, heard the French-Canadian who lodged just under Gilman talking to Aleksic one evening. They were telling each other how badly they dreaded the coming of the Walpurgis night, now only a few days off, and they were exchanging pitying comments about the poor, doomed young gentleman. De Roches, the fellow under Gilman's room, had spoken of nocturnal footsteps, both shod and unshod, and of the violet light he saw one night when he had stolen fearfully up to peer through Gilman's keyhole. He dared not peer, he told Aleksic, after he had glimpsed that light through the cracks around the door. There had been soft talking, too, and he had begun to describe its voice and had shrunk to an inaudible whisper. Elwood could not imagine what had set these superstitious creatures gossiping, but supposed that their imaginations had been roused by Gilman's late hours, or summoner walking and talking on one hand, and by the nearness of traditionally feared May-I on the other hand. That Gilman talked in his sleep was plain, and it was obviously from de Roche's keyhole listenings that the delusive notion of the violet dreamlight had got abroad. These simple people were quick to imagine they had seen any odd thing they had heard about, and as a plan of action, Gilman had better move down to Elwood's room to avoid sleeping alone. Elwood would, if wake, arouse him whenever he began to talk or rise in his sleep. Very soon, too, he must see the specialist. Meanwhile, they would take the spiky image around to the various museums and to certain professors, seeking identification and stating that it had been found in a public rubbish can. And Dombrowski must attend to the poisoning of those rats in the walls. Braced up by Elwood's companionship, Gilman attended class that day. Strange urges still tugged at him, but he could sidetrack them with considerable success. During a free period, he shewed the queer image to several professors, all of whom were intensely interested, though none of them should shed any light upon its nature or origin. That night, he slept on a couch which Elwood had the landlord bring into the second-story room, and for the first time in weeks he was wholly free from disquieting dreams. But the feverishness still hung on, and the whines of the loom-fixer were an unnerving influence. During the next few days, Gilman enjoyed an almost perfect immunity from morbid manifestations. He had, Elwood said, shewed no tendency to talk or rise in his sleep, and meanwhile the landlord was putting rat poison everywhere. The only disturbing element was talk amongst the superstitious foreigners, whose imaginations had become highly excited. Aleksic was always trying to make him get a crucifix, and finally forced one upon him, which had said had been blessed by the good father. De Roches, too, had something to say. In fact, he insisted that cautious steps had sounded in the now vacant room above him, on the first and second nights of Gilman's absence from it. Paul Kronowski, though he had heard sounds in the halls and on the stairs at night, had claimed that his door had been softly tried, while Mrs. Dombrowski vowed she had seen Brown Jenkin for the first time since All Hallows. But such naive reports could mean very little, and Gilman let the cheap metal crucifix hang idly from a knob on his host's dresser. For 3 days, Gilman and Elwood canvassed the local museums in an effort to identify the strange spiky image, but always without success. In every quarter, however, interest was intense, for the utter alienage of the thing was a tremendous challenge to scientific curiosity. One of the small radiating arms was broken off and subjected to chemical analysis, and the result is still talked about in college circles. Professor Ellery found platinum, iron, beryllium in the strange alloy, but mixed with these were at least 3 other apparent elements of highly atomic weight, which chemistry was absolutely powerless to classify. Not only did they fail to correspond with any known element, but they did not even fit the vacant places reserved for probable elements in the periodic system. The mystery remains unsolved to this day, though the image is on exhibition at the Museum of Miskatonic University. On the morning of April 27th, a fresh rat hole appeared in the room where Gilman was a guest. But Dombrowski tinned it up during the day. The poison was not having much effect, for scratchings and scurryings in the walls were virtually undiminished. Elwood was out late that night, and Gilman waited up for him. He did not wish to go to sleep in a room alone, especially since he thought he had glimpsed in the evening the twilight, the repellent old woman whose images had become so horribly transferred into his dreams. He wondered who she was, and what had been near her rattling tin can in the rubbish heap at the mouth of the squalid courtyard. The crone had seemed to notice him and leer evilly at him, though perhaps this was merely his imagination. The next day, both youths felt very tired, and they knew they would sleep like logs when night came. And in the evening they drowsily discussed the mathematical studies in which had so completely and perhaps harmfully engrossed Gilman, and speculated about the linkage with ancient magic and the folklore which seemed so darkly probable. They spoke of old Keziah Mason, and Elwood agreed that Gilman had good scientific grounds for thinking she might have stumbled on strange and significant information. The hidden cults to which these witches belonged often guarded and handed down surprising secrets from elder and forgotten aeons. And it was by no means impossible that Keziah had actually mastered the art of passing through dimensional gates. Tradition emphasizes the uselessness of material barriers in holding a witch's motions. And who can say what underlies the old tale of broomstick rides through the night? Whether a modern student could ever again gain similar powers from a mathematical research alone was still to be seen. Success, Gilman added, might lead to dangerous and unthinkable situations, for who could foretell the condition pervading an adjacent but normally inaccessible dimension? On the other hand, the picturesque possibilities were enormous. Time could not exist in certain belts of space, and by entering and remaining in such a belt, one might preserve one's life, age, indefinitely, never suffering organic metabolism or deterioration, except for slight amounts incurred during visits to one's own or similar planes. One might, for example, pass into a timeless dimension and emerge at some remote period of Earth's history as young as before. Whether anybody has ever managed to do this, one could hardly conjecture with any degree of authority. Old legends are hazy and ambiguous. And in historic times, all attempts at crossing forbidden gaps seem complicated by strange and terrible alliances, beings and messengers from outside. There was an immemorial figure of deputy or messenger of hidden and terrible powers, the man of the witch cult, the Narathiathep of the Necronomicon. These, too, the baffling problems of the lesser messengers or intermediaries, the quasi-animals, the queer hybrids, which legend depicts as witches' familiars. As Gilman and Elwood retired, too sleepy to argue further, they heard Joe Malkowich's reel into the house half-drunk, and shuddered at the desperate wildness of his whining prayers. That night, Gilman saw the violet light again, in his dream, and he had heard the scratching and gnawing in the partitions, and though that someone fumbled clumsily at the latch, then he saw the old woman and the small furry thing advancing towards him over the carpeted floor. The beldame's face was alight with inhuman exultation, and the little yellow-toothed morbidity tittered mockingly as it pointed at the heavily sleeping form of Elwood on the other couch across the room. A paralysis of fear stifled all attempts to cry out. As once before, the hideous crone seized Gilman by the shoulders, yanking him out of the bed and into empty space. Again, the infinitude of shrieking twilight abysses flashed past him, but in another second he thought he was in dark, muddy, unknown alley of fetid odors, with the rotting walls of ancient houses towering above on every hand. Again was the robed man he had seen at the peaked space the other day, while from a lesser distance the old woman was beckoning and grimacing imperiously. Brown Jenkin was rubbing itself with a kind of affectionate playfulness around the ankles of the man, which the mud largely concealed. There was a dark open doorway on the right, to which the man silently pointed. Into this the grimacing crone started, dragging Gilman after her in his pyjama sleeve. There was an evil-smelling staircase which creaked ominously, and on which the old woman seemed to radiate a faint, violent light. And finally, the door leading off a landing. The crone fumbled with the latch and pushed the door open, motioning Gilman to wait and disappearing inside the black aperture. The youth's oversensitive ears caught a hideously strangled cry, and presently the beldame came out of the room bearing a small, senseless form which she thrust at the dreamer, as if ordering him to carry it. The sight of this form, and the expression on its face, broke the spell. Still too dazed to cry out, he plunged recklessly down the noisome staircase and into the mud outside, halting only when seized and choked by the waiting man. A consciousness departed. He heard the faint, shrill tittering of the fanged rat-like abnormality. On the morning of the 29th, Gilman awakened to a maelstrom of horror. The instant he opened his eyes, he knew something was terribly wrong, for he was back in his old garret room, with the slanting wall and the ceiling, sprawled on the now unmade bed. His throat was aching inexplicably, and as he struggled into the sitting posture, he saw with growing fright that his feet and pyjama bottoms were brown with caked mud. For the moment, his recollection was hopelessly hazy, but, as he knew, at least he must have been sleepwalking. Elwood had been lost too deeply in slumber to hear and stop him. On the floor were confused muddy prints, but oddly enough they did not extend all the way to the door. The more Gilman looked at them, the more peculiar they seemed, for in addition to those he could recognize as his, there were some smaller, almost rounder markings, such as the legs of a large chair or table might make, except that most of them tended to be divided into halves. There were also some curious muddy rat tracks leading out of a fresh hole and back into it again. Utter bewilderment and fear of madness racked Gilman as he staggered to the door and saw that there were no muddy prints outside. The more he remembered of his hideous dream, the more he felt terrified, and it added to his desperation to hear Joe Aleksic chanting mournfully 2 floors below. Descending to Elwood's room, he roused his still-sleeping host and began to tell of how he found himself, but Elwood could form no idea of what might have really happened, where Gilman could have been, and how he got back to his room without making tracks in the hall, and how the muddy furniture-like prints came to be mixed with his in the garret chamber were wholly beyond conjecture. Then there were those dark, livid marks on his throat, as if he had tried to strangle himself. He put his hands up to them, but found they did not even approximately fit. While they were talking, Desroches dropped in to say he had heard a terrific clattering overhead in the dark small hours. No, there had been no one on the stairs after midnight, though just before midnight he heard faint footfalls in the garret, and cautiously descending steps he did not like. It was, he added, very bad time of year for Arkham. The young gentleman had better be sure to wear the crucifix Joe Aleksic had given him. Even in the daytime was not safe, for after dawn there had been strange sounds in the house, especially a thin, childish wail hastily choked off. Gilman mechanically attended classes that morning, but was wholly unable to fix his mind on his studies. A mood of hideous apprehension and expectancy had seized him, and he seemed to be awaiting the fall of some annihilating blow. At noon, he lunched at the university spa, picking up a paper from next the seat as he waited for dessert. But he never ate that dessert, for an item on the paper's first page left him limp, wide-eyed, and unable only to pay his check and stagger back to Elwood's room. There had been a strange kidnapping the night before in Oren's gangway, and the 2-year-old child of a clod-like laundry worker named Anastasia Woljako had completely vanished from sight. The mother, it appeared, had feared the event for some time, but the reasons she assigned for her fear were so grotesque that no one took them seriously. She had, she said, seen Brown Jenkin about the place now and then ever since early March, and knew from its grimaces and titterings that little Lattice must be marked for sacrifice at the awful Sabbat on Walpurgis night. She had asked her neighbour, Mary Knask, to sleep in the room and to try to protect the child, but Mary had not dared. She couldn't even tell the police, for they never believed such things. Children had been taken away that way every year since she could remember, and her friend, Peter Stolwaki, could not help because he wanted the child out of the way anyhow. But what threw Gilman into cold perspiration was the report of a pair of revellers who had been walking past the mouth of the gangway just after midnight. They admitted they had been drunk, but they both vowed to seeing a crazily dressed trio furtively entering a dark passageway. There had, they said, been a huge robed man, a little woman in rags, and a young white man in his nightclothes. The old woman had been dragging the youth, while around the feet of the man a tamed rat was rubbing and weaving in the brown mud. Gilman sat in a daze all afternoon, and Elwood, who had meanwhile seen the papers and formed terrible conjectures from them, found him thus when he came home. This time, neither could doubt that something hideously serious was closing in around them. Between the phantasms of the nightmare and the realities of the objective of the monstrous and unthinkable relationship was crystallizing, and only stupendous vigilance would avert still more direful developments. Gilman must see a specialist sooner or later, but not just now when all the papers were full of this kidnapping business. Just what had really happened was maddeningly obscure. For a moment, both Gilman and Elwood exchanged whispered theories of the wildest kind. Had Gilman unconsciously succeeded better than he knew in his studies of space and its time dimensions? Had he actually slipped outside our sphere to the point of unguessed and unimaginable, where, if anywhere, he had been on those nights of demonic allegiance? The roaring twilight abysses, the green hillside, the blistering terrace, the pools from the stars, the ultimate black vortex, the man, the muddy alleyway, the stairs, the old witch, the fanged furry horror, the bubble congeries, the little polyhedron, the strange sunburn, the wrist wound, the unexplained image, the muddy feet, the throat marks, the tales and fears of the superstitious foreigners. What did it all mean? And to what extent could the laws of sanity apply to such a case? There was no sleep for either of them that night, but the next day they both cut class and doused. This was April 30. With the dusk would come a hellish Sabbath time, which all foreigners and superstitious old folk feared. Mousewitch came home at 6 o'clock and said people at the mill were whispering that the Walpurgis revels would be held in the dark ravine beyond the meadow hill where the old white stone stands, in a place queerly void of all plant life. Some of them had even told the police and advised them to look for their missing child. But they did not believe anything would be done. Joe insisted that the poor young gentleman wear the nickel-chained crucifix, and Gilman put it on and dropped it inside his shirt to humour the fellow. Late at night, the two youths sat drowsing in their chairs, lulled by the rhythmical praying of the loom fixer on the floor below. Gilman listened as he nodded. His preternally sharpened hearing seemed to strain for some subtle, dreaded murmur beyond the noises in the ancient house. Unwholesome recollections of things in the Necronomicon and the Black Book welled up. He found himself swaying to infardious rhythms said to pertain to the blackest ceremonies of the Sabbath, and to have an origin outside the time and space we comprehend. Presently he realized what he was listening for, the hellish chant of the celebrants in the distant Black Valley. How did he know so much about what they expected? How did he know the time when Nahab and her acolyte were due to bear the brimming bowl which would follow the black cock and the black goat? He saw that Elwood had dropped asleep and tried to call out and waken him, but something, however, closed his throat. He was not his own master. Had he signed the man's book after all? Then his fevered, abnormal hearing caught the distant, wind-borne notes. Over miles of hill and field and alley they came, but he recognized them none the less. The fires must be lit and the dancers must be starting in. How could he keep himself from going? And what it had enmeshed him, mathematics, folklore, the house, old Keziah, Brown Jenkin, and now he saw that there was a fresh rat hole in the wall near his couch. Above the ceiling chanting and the nearer praying of Joe Malkowitz came another sound, a stealthy, determined scratching in the partitions. He hoped the electric lights would not go out. Then he saw the fanged, bearded little face in the rat hole, the accursed little face, which he at last realized bore such a shocking, mocking resemblance to old Keziah's. And he heard the faint fumbling at the door. The screaming twilight abysses flashed before him, and he felt himself helpless in a formless grasp of iridescent bubble congress. Ahead raced the small kaleidoscopic polyhedron, and all through the churning void was a heightened acceleration, vague tonal pattern which seemed to foreshadow some unutterable, unendurable climax. He seemed to know what was coming, the monstrous burst of Walpurgis rhythm, in whose cosmic timbre would be concentrated all the primal ultimate space-time seethings which lie beyond the mass spheres of matter and sometimes break forth in measured reverberations, and that penetrate faintly to an ever layer of entity, giving hideous significance throughout the worlds to a certain dreaded period. But after all this vanished in a second, he was again in the cramped, violet-lit peaked space with the slanting door, the low cases of ancient books, the bench and the table, the queer objects, and the triangular gulf at one side. On the table lay a small white figure, an infant boy, unclothed, unconscious. And while on the other side stood a monstrous, leering old woman, with a gleaming, grotesque half-knife in her hand, and queer proportioned pale metal bowl covered with curious chased designs and having delicate lateral handles in her left. She was intoning some croaking ritual in a language which Gilman could not understand, but which seemed like something gaudily quoted in the Necronomicon. As the scene grew clearer, he saw the ancient crone bend forward and extend the empty bowl across the table, and unable to control his own motions, he reached afar forward and took it in both hands, noticing, as he did so, its comparative lightness. At the same moment, the disgusting form of Brown Jenkins scrambled up over the brink of the triangular black gulf on his left. The crone now motioned for him to hold the bowl in a certain position while she raised the huge, grotesque knife about the small white victim as high as her right hand could reach. The fanged furry thing began tittering, a continuation of the unknown ritual, while the witch croaked loathsome responses. Gilman felt gnawing, poignant abhorrence shoot through his mental and emotional paralysis, and the light mental bowl shook in his grasp. A second later, the downward motion of the knife broke the spell completely. He dropped the bowl with a resounding bell-like clangor, while his hands darted out frantically to stop the monstrous deed. In an instant, he edged up the slanting floor around the edge of the table and wrenched the knife from the old woman's claws, sending it clattering over the brink into the narrow triangular gulf. In another instant, however, matters were reversed, for those murderous claws locked themselves tightly around his own throat, while the wrinkled face twisted with insane fury. He felt the chain of the cheap crucifix grinding into his neck, and in his peril wondered how the sight of the object itself would affect the evil creature. Her strength was altogether superhuman, but as she continued her choking, he reached feebly in his shirt and drew out the metal symbol, snapping the chain and pulling it free. At the sight of the device, the witch seemed struck with panic. Her grip relaxed long enough to give Gilman a chance to break it entirely. He pulled the steel-like claws from his neck and would have dragged the beldame over the edge of the gulf had the claws not received a fresh access to strength and closed in again. This time he resolved to reply in kind. His own hands reached out for the creature's throat. Before she saw what he was doing, he had the chain of the crucifix twisted about her neck, and a moment later he had tightened it enough to cut off her breath. During her last struggle, he felt something bite at his ankle and saw that Brown Jenkins had come to her aid. With one savage kick, he sent the morbidity over the edge of the gulf and heard it whimper on some level far below. Whether he had killed the ancient crone, he did not know, but he left her rest on the floor where she had fallen. Then, as he turned away, he saw the table, a sight which nearly snapped the last thread of reason. Brown Jenkins, tough of sinew, with 4 tiny hands of demonic dexterity, had been busy while the witch was throttling him, and in his efforts had been in vain. What he had prevented with the knife from doing so to the victim's chest, the yellow fangs of the furry blasphemy had done to a wrist. The bowl, so lately on the floor, stood full beside the small, lifeless body. In his dream delirium, Gilman heard the hellish alien rhythm chant of the Sabbat coming from an infinite distance, and he knew the man must be there. Confused memories mixed themselves with his mathematics, and he believed his subconscious mind held the angles which he needed to guide him back to the normal world, alone and unaided for the first time. He felt sure he was in the immemorial sealed loft above his room, but whether he could ever escape through the slanting floor or the long-stepped egress, he doubted greatly. Besides, would not an escape from a dream loft bring him merely into a dream house, an abnormal projection of the actual place he sought? He was wholly bewildered as to the realization betwixt the dream and reality in all of his experiences. The passage through the vague abysses would be frightful, for the Walpurgis rhythm would be vibrating, and at last he would have to hear the hitherto veiled cosmic pulsing which he so mortally dreaded. Even now he could detect a low, monstrous shaking whose tempo he suspected all too well. At Sabbath time it always mounted and reached through the worlds to summon innate, nameless rites. Half chants of the Sabbath were patterned on this faintly overheard pulsing which no earthly ear could endure in its unveiled spatial fullness. Gilman wondered, too, whether he could trust his instincts to take him back to the right part of space. How could he be sure he would not land on that green-litten hillside of a far planet, or tasseled terrace above a city of tentacled monsters somewhere beyond the galaxy, or spiraled black vortices of the ultimate void of chaos where reigns the mindless Daemon Sultan Azeroth? Just before he made the plunge, the violet light went out and left him in the utter blackness. The old witch, Keziah Nahab, must have meant her death. Though mixed with the distant chant of the Sabbath and the whimperings of Brown Jenkins in the gulf below, he thought he heard another, wilder whine from unknown depths. Joe Malkovich, the prayers against the crawling chaos now turned inexplicably triumphant shriek, the words of sardonic actuality impining on the vortices of furball dream. The goat with 1,000 young. They found Gilman on the floor of his queerly angled old garret room before dawn, for a terrible cry had brought Doroshes and Krononsky and Dombrowski and Mausowitsch at once, and even wakened the soundly sleeping Elwood in his chair. He was alive and with open staring eyes, but seemed largely unconscious. On his throat were the marks of murderous hands, and on his left ankle a distressing rat bite. His clothes were badly rumpled, and Joe's crucifix was missing. Elwood trembled, afraid even to speculate on what new form his friend's sleeping had taken. Malsowich seemed half dazed because of a sign he said he had in response to his prayers. He crossed himself frantically when squealing and whimpering of a rat sounded from beyond the slanting partition. When the dreamer was settled on his couch in Elwood's room, they sent for Dr. Milkowski, a local practitioner who would repeat no tales where they might prove embarrassing, and he gave Gilman 2 hypodermic injections, which caused him to relax in something like natural drowsiness. During the day, the patient regained consciousness at times and whispered his newest dream disjointedly to Elwood. It was a painful process, and at its very start brought out a fresh, disconcerting fact. Gilman, whose ears had been so lately possessed an abnormal sensitiveness, was now stone deaf. Dr. Mowalski, summoned again in haste, told Elwood that both eardrums were ruptured, as if by the impact of some stupendous sound intense beyond all human conception or endurance. How such a sound could have been heard in the last few hours without arousing all the Miskatonic Valley was more than honest physician could say. Elwood wrote his part of the colloquy on paper, so that a fairly easy communication was maintained. Neither knew what to make of the whole chaotic business, and decided that it would be better if they thought as little about it as possible. Both, though, agreed that it must leave this ancient and accursed house as soon as it could be arranged. Evening papers spoke of a police raid on some curious revelers in a ravine beyond the Meadow Hill just before dawn, and mentioned that the white stone there was an object of age-long superstitious regard. Nobody had been caught, but among the scattering fugitives had been glimpsed a huge man in black robes. In another column it was stated that no trace of the missing child had been found. The crowning horror came that very night. Elwood will never forget. He was forced to stay out of college for the rest of the term because of the resulting nervous breakdown. He had thought he heard rats in the petition all evening, but paid little attention to them. Then after both he and Gilman had retired, the atrocious shrieking began. Elwood jumped, turned on the lights, and rushed over to his guest's couch. The occupant was emitting a sound vertebly inhuman in nature, as if racked by some torment beyond description. He was writhing under the bedclothes. A giant red stain was beginning to appear on the blankets. Elwood scarcely dared touch him, but gradually the screaming and writhing subsided. By this time, Dombrowski, Krononsky, Desroches, and Malsowich, all the top-floor lodgers, were crowding into the doorway, and the landlord had sent his wife back to the telephone for Dr. Mowalski. Everybody shrieked when the large rat-like form suddenly jumped out from beneath the unsinged bedclothes and scuttled across the floor into a fresh open hole close by. When the doctor arrived and began to pull down the frightful covers, Walter Gilman was dead. It would be barbarous to do more than suggest what had killed Gilman. There had been a virtual tunnel through his body. Something had eaten his heart out. Dombrowski, frantic at the failure of his constant rat-poisoning efforts, cast aside all thought of his lease, and within a week had moved, with all his other lodgers, to a dingy but less ancient house in Walnut Street. The worst, for a thing, was keeping Joe Malsowich quiet. The brooding gloom-fixer would never stay sober, and was constantly whining and muttering about spectral and terrible things. It seems that on that last hideous night, Joe had stopped to look at the crimson rat tracks which led from Gilman's couch to a nearby hole. On the carpet they were very indistinct, but a piece of open flooring intervened between the carpet's edge and the baseboard. There Malsowich had found something monstrous, though he thought he had, for no one else could quite agree with him despite the undeniable queerness of the prints. The tracks on the flooring were certainly vastly unlike the average prints of a rat, but even Krononsky and Desroches would not admit that they were like the prints of 4 tiny human hands. The house was never again rented. As soon as Dombrowski left it, in the pale of its final desolation began to descend, for people shunned it both on the account of its old reputation and because of the new fetid odor. Perhaps the ex-landlord's rat poison had worked after all, for not long after his departure, the place became a neighborhood nuisance. Health officials traced the smell to the closed spaces above and beside the eastern garret room, and agreed that the number of dead rats must be enormous. They decided, however, that it was not worth their while to hew open and disinfect the long sealed spaces, for the photo would soon be over, and the locality was not one which encouraged fastidious standards. Indeed, there were always vague local tales of unexplained stenches upstairs in the witch's house just after May Eve or Hallow Mass. The neighbors grumbling acquiesced in the inertia, but the photo nonetheless formed an additional count against the place. Towards the last house was condemned as in habitation by the building inspector. Gilman's dreams and their attendant circumstances have never been explained. Elwood, whose thoughts on the entire episode are sometimes almost maddening, came back to college the next autumn and graduated in the following June. He found the spectral gossip of the town much diminished, and it is indeed a fact that, notwithstanding certain reports of ghostly tittering in the deserted house which lasted almost as long as the edifice itself, no fresh appearances of either old Keziah or of Brown Jenkin had been muttered since Gilman's death. It is rather fortunate that Elwood was not in Arkham in that later year, when certain events abruptly renewed the local whispers about elder horrors. Of course he heard about the matter afterwards and suffered untold torments of black and bewildered speculation. But even that was not as bad as the actual nearness and several possible sights that would have been. In March 1931, a gale wrecked the roof and the great chimney of the vacant witch house, so that a chaos of crumbling bricks, blackened moss-grown shingles, and rotting planks and timbers crashed down into the loft and broke through to the floor beneath. The whole attic story was choked with debris from above, but no one took the trouble to touch the mess before the inevitable razing of the decrepit structure. That ultimate step came in the following December, and it was when Gilman's old room was cleared out by reluctant, apprehensive workmen that the gossip began. Among the rubbish which had crashed through the ancient slanting ceiling were several things which made the workmen pause and call the police. Later, the police in turn called the coroner and several professors from the university. There were bones, badly crushed and splintered, but clearly recognizable as human, whose manifestly modern date conflicted puzzlingly with the remote period at which their only possible lurking place, the low slanted roof loft overhead, had supposedly been sealed from all human access, but the coroner's physician decided that it belonged to some small child, while certain others, found with mixed shreds of rotten brownish cloth, belonged to a rather undersized bent female of advanced years. Careful sifting of the debris also disclosed many tiny bones of rats caught in the collapse, as well as older rat bones gnawed by small fangs in a fashion now and then highly productive of controversy and reflection. Other objects found included the mingled fragments of many books and papers, together with yellowish dust left from the total disintegration of still older books and papers. All without exception appeared to deal with black magic in its most advanced and horrible forms, and the evidently recent date of certain items is still a mystery as unsolved as of the modern human bones. And even greater mystery is the absolute homogeny of the crabbed, archaic writing found in a wild range of papers, whose conditions and watermarks suggest the age differences of at least 150 to 200 years. To some, though, the greatest mystery of all is the varied of utterly unexplicable objects whose shapes, materials, types of workmanship, purposes baffle all conjecture, found scattered amidst the wreckage in evidently diverse states of injury. One of these things, which excited several Miskatonic professors profoundly, is a badly damaged monstrosity, plainly resembling the strange image which Gilman gave to the college museum. save it is larger, wrought of some peculiar bluish stone instead of metal, and possessed of a singularly angled pedestal of undecipherable hieroglyphics. Archaeologists and anthropologists are still trying to explain the bizarre designs chased on the crushed bowl of light metal whose inner side bore ominous brownish stains when found. Foreigners and credulous grandmothers are equalled garrulous about the modern nickel crucifix, with broken chain mixed in with the rubbish and shiveringly identified by Cho Mousewitsch as that which he had given poor Gilman many years before. Some believe this crucifix was dragged up to the sealed lofts by rats, while others think it must have been on the floor in some corner of Gilman's old room the whole time. Still, others, including Joe himself, have theories too wild and fantastic for sober credence. When the slanting wall of Gilman's room was torn out, the once sealed triangular space between that partition and the house's north wall was found to contain much less structural debris, even in the proportion to its size, than the room itself, though it had a ghastly layer of old materials which paralyzed the wreckers with horror. In brief, the floor was a veritable ossuary of bones of small children, some fairly modern, but others extending back in infinite gradations to a period so remote that the crumbling was almost complete. On deep, bony layer rested a knife of great size, obvious antiquity, and grotesque and ornate and exotic in design, above which all the debris was piled. In the midst of this debris, wedged between a fallen plank and a cluster of cemented bricks from the ruined chimney, was an object destined to cause even more bafflement, veiled fright, and openly superstitious talk in Arkham than anything else discovered in the haunted and accursed building. This object was the partially crushed skeleton of a huge deceased rat, whose abnormalities of form are still a topic of debate and source of singular reticence among members of the Miskatonic Department of Comparative Anatomy. Very little concerning this skeleton has leaked out, but the workmen who found it whisper in shocked tones about the long brownish hairs which it was associated. The bones of the tiny paws, it is rumored, imply prehensile characteristics more typical of a diminutive monkey than of a rat, while the small skull, with its savage yellow fangs, of the utmost anomalousness, appeared from certain angles like a miniature, monstrously degraded parody of a human skull. The workmen crossed themselves in fright when they came upon this blasphemy, but later burned candles of gratitude to St. Stanilius Church because of the shrill, ghostly tittering they felt they would never hear again. That concludes our tale for this week, my friend. Please return next week, and we will continue with another short story by H.P. Lovecraft. If you wish to rest some more, please find a space that suits you, whether you curl up by the fire, partake in some food and beverages in our kitchen, take a nap in one of our many rooms, or take a stroll around the garden. Please know you are always welcome at Sniper's Rest, my friend. If you are continuing your journey, the multiverse has an ever-changing set of portals for you to explore. So good luck, my friend, wherever you end up. Wherever you come from, and wherever you're going, thank you for spending some time here with us at Sniper's Rest. Remember to take care of yourself, be kind to others, hydrate, take a moment to look out into the world and marvel at how incredible it all is. How incredible you are, friend. Until next time, please take care on your way.